So, what should TESOL candidates know about second language acquisition theory? And in particular, what should those who teach online take into special consideration? First of all, research has shown us that language is social action through which we voice our experiences, we co-create, and we negotiate our identities. So language isn't what we typically think of it as this sign signifier system. It's bigger than that. It's what we do, not exclusively what we use. So it is through this language practice and language action that we create ourselves and other selves and our world. So if you imagine language as having this kind of creative and generative power, language interaction in general, is where language was born. It's where language evolves and ultimately where we learn language. So interaction is very important in language learning. So much so that we speak to learn. We don't learn to speak. We don't remain silent in some corner just observing and then 2-3 years later we can magically talk, right? Speaking and interacting and knowing and doing language is something we learn through participation, through interaction, and something that is not only the process of participation, this learning, but also the product and the outcome of it. So, knowing that interaction is so important, and knowing that we speak and do language to learn, not just learn it and then do it later, teachers have to facilitate learning through meaningful, purposeful, planned, and scaffolded, supported, guided, mediated, whatever you want to call it, but scaffolded interaction. So, effective interaction in the classroom is something that's planned. It doesn't just happen. You can't go into a classroom situation and say, okay, talk amongst yourselves and language learning happens. We have to plan it. We have to think about the kinds of groups that we're going to create in the classroom. We have to think about our strategies, and we have to think of the number of people that are participating in these groups, the time it's going to take to do whatever activity, right? And when you're thinking about grouping strategies, for example, if you're considering the number of people in groupings, you would think of, okay, the whole class is one big group. And you would do that for presenting new information, for assessment, for modeling new skills, for demonstrations, presentations. Or you might think of one-on-one or one-on-one or one-to-one interaction with a teacher as a sort of grouping. So if a student is working by themselves and then the teacher would be walking around talking to each individual, that would be another type of interaction that's planned in the classroom. Paired interactions, right, 2x2s, duos, they're very important as well. And we can do that for brainstorming, for think, pair, share, for checking homework, for peer evaluations, all kinds of activities in learning language. And we can think of smaller groups, right, 3 or 4 people for certain activities, and then larger groups, so maybe 4 or 5 for other more complicated activities. So how do we plan these small groups or large groups when we think about them? Do we plan them as groups that are pretty similar among the members, everybody having a similar proficiency level, everybody having a similar first language background, for example? Or do we have them differ, right? The purposes that we have and we prepare and we plan for these groups would contribute to determining if they're going to be more homogeneous or heterogeneous in the way that we plan them. The point is that interaction does not just happen. We plan and we prepare for it, knowing that the majority of learning does take place in this way. So, we also think about maximizing student talk time for language learning. Second language learning theory has shown us that you have to make very clear expectations for classroom participation, because when students understand the goals, then they have a clearer path to fulfilling them, right? So you have to also make a clear definition of success in interaction. For example, you're going to explain very explicitly to your students when you're going to prioritize accuracy in their content and the context of their ideas versus accuracy and perfection in the grammatical forms or directed focus on forms. So when you make clear what defines success in interaction and participation, then you can maximize what students are able to get out of it and the learning that occurs in classroom participation. A very important thing to think about when we really heavily rely on interaction and participation in interaction for language learning is we have to share power. And in the classroom, power is talk time, right? Those who are seen as more powerful, more legitimate participants are usually those who get to talk for the longest and the most, right? Usually those with the highest proficiency levels or those who are seen as having the authority in the classroom, for example. So talk time is power in the classroom. It's also control in a classroom that relies heavily on interaction and participation. So we have to share it. You're a language teacher. You already know English, right? Your students, they don't know it as well as you do. So therefore, we ask that you have a student-centered classroom where they get to talk a lot more than you do in order to maximize their ability to do language, to practice, to engage, ultimately to learn. And also, when we're relying a lot on group interaction and we're planning a lot of group interaction, we have to delegate the responsibilities, right? And leadership in groups. So just as we're figuring out if they're going to be small groups or large groups, we also have to figure out what are the roles that each individual member plays in these groups. So who's going to be the recorder? Who's going to report or share out afterwards? Who's going to host or manage or organize? Who's going to keep everybody on task, make sure that they're working on the topic at hand or the project at hand? And who is going to be in charge of maybe just organizing in general or managing the group in general and coordinating with you, the instructor? So when we think about this, this contributes to the planning that we do for effective interaction, for fruitful and meaningful interaction in the classroom, which ultimately will maximize student talk time and contribution, responsibility, and ultimately learning in the classroom. So we plan for input, we plan for the sort of language that they're going to be getting and listening to, and we plan for interaction, we plan for them to negotiate meaning, to talk, to think, and to figure out interaction with each other. And we also plan in this negotiation for meaning for output, for production. We give them guidelines and frames and expectations and all of these support and scaffolds we provide to maximize student time and language learning. So, when you teach online, what are the special considerations that, in addition to all I've discussed so far, that you have to take at heart, right, when you do online teaching? First of all, in online teaching, your preparation is double. Right? If you're meeting face to face, a lot of things kind of happen organically or spontaneously. You can move people and do all sorts of things with people. When you're teaching online, you have to really double your preparation because you have to anticipate what are the capacities that you have, what are the possibilities for grouping or for forums or for virtual interaction outside the classroom space or interaction within the confines of the classroom learning management system, for example. So your preparation definitely has to be concerted and it has to be very thoughtful. And when you're working online, things tend to take a lot more time than they do when you're face to face, because you have to, once again, you have to negotiate with technology, make sure everybody has their camera feed or audio feed working properly, the groupings are working properly, etc. So you plan and prepare for this. Time management. becomes a huge issue when you're teaching online, because in order to get the most out of the different interactions, the varied types of engagements that you plan to maximize learning, maximize talk time in your language classroom, you have to plan time and you have to really manage it effectively to be able to do the most and take the best advantage of a very unique opportunity to engage in this way. So we also have to understand what are the benefits and the drawbacks of the particular technology that you're going to be relying on in online teaching. So this is very important. If the particular portal that you're working with or the system that you're working with allows for live multi-party synchronous discussion, you definitely, that's a huge benefit and you can work with that. If it doesn't, if it's asynchronous and you have to plan activities that are pre-prepared or mediated in some way that's not one-on-one live in action, then you prepare accordingly. And also understand what are the limitations of technology. How are you going to know and manage and navigate when tech doesn't always cooperate with you all the time? So a profound understanding of the platform that you're working with goes a long way in being able to make sure that your students are speaking to learn, they're doing language to learn, not just sitting back and then hoping one day to magically acquire language. Now, one big thing that we have that's a tremendous benefit when we work online is that we have this world of magnificent technology that we can use, and our students are also very versed in different types of technology as well. So use that to your benefit. Marshal your students' expertise to support and to introduce activities that would enrich what you're already doing in the classroom. So if they know coding, or if they know all sorts of fun ways to introduce live interaction and video into what it is that you're doing, or all kinds of virtual experiences, tap into that. And that also makes them feel more invested, more engaged and responsible ultimately for the learning that goes on and for their place in this classroom community of practice. Because we have to recognize that we have access to not only just our students, but their worlds as well. So when you're working online, you are located where you're located, but your students are also located in very distant places, and they might be kind of signing in to your class from their homes, from their place of business or place of employment, or you might see their family, their pets, and all kinds of things that you necessarily, or scenarios and contexts you necessarily don't have access to when you just meet in a live classroom at a school or some kind of institution. So recognize that you have this special kind of access to them, to their expertise, and also to the world around them, and make use of that. Acknowledge it. Recognize that there are whole human beings with identities and worlds outside of the classroom, and when possible, when appropriate, introduce all of that into the work that you do into the classroom. And finally, when you teach online, it's very important to foster community and encourage local relevance, right? And pushing or pulling the world that surrounds each individual student and participant in your virtual classroom community, pull it in, right? And use that to foster this virtual world and imagined community that you have in the classroom, because it's kind of difficult and sometimes seems somewhat distant, right? Even though you can see people's homes sometimes, or their office, or these places you wouldn't see in a regular school classroom, the medium itself seems somewhat distant. You're looking at faces and pictures online and beamed through the space, right? Or you're reading their forums and postings in written responses. So it might seem that there's this barrier, this distance, right, that you can't broach because you can't stand next to them or touch them or engage personally. But there's still ways that we can foster and make very important the community that we build. And we do that by, of course, focusing on the interaction that we have within the online classroom, but also encouraging the local relevance of the world and the practices and the understandings of the context, right, from which each individual participant in this community is coming. So keep all of that in mind and understand that this is what we do in order to foster learning in our unique online teaching environment. Good luck.